I was sold like property until the Alpha King burned my collar. Dust tasted like rusted copper. I pressed my forehead against the cold iron of the cage, vibrations from the auction block rattling my teeth. They sold me for a handful of dirty bills. My own flesh and blood. Because my vocal cords were dead space. Because an Omega who can't scream is either worthless or a premium commodity for the sickest bidders. My name is Caleb, I'm 23 years old, and I have never spoken a single word out loud. The cage smelled of old fear, not mine, but the accumulated terror of every Omega who had been dragged across this floor before me. Sweat pooled at the base of my spine, chilling instantly against the drafty concrete of the holding pen. I traced the uneven seams of my frayed denim jeans, focusing on the rough texture rather than the heavy, suffocating scent of cheap cologne and desperation thickening the air. Marcus, my older brother, stood 3 feet away. He was nervously flicking a counterfeit gold lighter open and shut. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound drilled into my temples. He smelled of sour mash whiskey and the sharp, anxious pheromones of an unaccomplished beta trying to punch above his weight. "Don't look at me like that, Caleb," Marcus muttered, not meeting my eyes. He shoved a crumpled piece of paper into his leather jacket. "Dad's debts are calling. You don't do anything around the house anyway. You just sit there. You stare. It's creepy." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "At least this way you're paying your rent." I didn't blink. I just stared at the pulse jumping in his thick neck. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to open my mouth and let out a vicious, mocking sound that would peel the paint off the walls. But my throat was a hollow, broken drum. It had been since birth. A defect. An Omega who couldn't sing, couldn't coo, couldn't scream when they hit him. In my family's eyes, I wasn't a person. I was a broken appliance taking up floor space. The auction handler, a hulking alpha with a neck the size of a tree trunk, unlocked the cage. The hinges groaned. He didn't speak to me. He just reached in, his meaty fingers clamping around my bicep. His grip was bruising, careless. He hauled me up. My knees buckled slightly. I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. A half-stale piece of toast left on the counter, but I caught my balance. I had to. Falling meant kicks. Kicks meant bruised ribs. Bruised ribs made it hard to breathe. And breathing was the only thing I was currently good at. Marcus stepped back, watching the handler snap a heavy, unyielding leather collar around my throat. The buckle pinched my skin. It smelled of old oil and someone else's dried sweat. My stomach rolled. 50,000, Marcus told the handler, his voice cracking on the number. "That's the reserve. Don't let him go for less." The handler snorted, yanking the attached chain. "He's mute. You're lucky if you get 20. Buyers like them to make noise." I stumbled forward, my bare feet slapping against the grimy linoleum floor of the corridor. The lights overhead buzzed, flickering a sickly yellow. I kept my eyes down. The cynical part of my brain, the part that kept me sane, calculated my worth. 20,000. A cheap sedan. A decent kitchen remodel. That's what a lifetime of my silent obedience bought. The double doors at the end of the hall opened, and the noise of the underground auction floor washed over me. It wasn't the refined, champagne clinking affair you saw in movies. It was a subterranean meat market. Smoke hung in the rafters. The smell was a nauseating cocktail of cigar ash, spilled beer, and the oppressive, competing scents of alphas posturing for dominance. The handler dragged me up 3 wooden steps onto a makeshift stage. The spotlight blinded me. I squinted, turning my head slightly, catching the dust motes dancing in the harsh white beam. I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. Crying was a performance for an audience that cared, and there was no one here who gave a damn about the water leaking from my eyes. I just let my shoulders slump, withdrawing into the quiet, dark room inside my head. Next lot. The auctioneer barked into a staticky microphone. Unclaimed Omega. 23 years old. Defective vocal cords, completely mute. Perfect for those who prefer a quiet house. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Crude, ugly laughter. Bid started low. Insultingly low. 500. 7. 12. I watched a man in the front row, his shirt stained with mustard, raise a paddle. My stomach seized. I knew what men like that did with things that couldn't say no. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted the familiar metallic tang of my own blood. Then the atmospheric pressure in the room dropped. It wasn't a metaphor. The air actually grew heavy, pressing against my eardrums. The idle chatter died. The overlapping, suffocating scents of 100 different alphas were suddenly obliterated by something singular and terrifying. Pine. Sharp, biting ozone. The smell of a lightning strike moments before it turns a tree to ash. I opened my eyes, peering through the glare of the spotlight. The crowd parted. They didn't just step aside. They recoiled, pulling their chins down in involuntary submission. He didn't look like a king. He didn't wear a crown or a cape. He wore a charcoal suit that fit perfectly over a frame built for violence, but the fabric was slightly wrinkled at the elbows, like he'd been wearing it for a 14-hour flight. His dark hair was carelessly pushed back, silver threading the temples. But it was his eyes that pinned me to the floorboards. Slate gray. Cold. Exhausted. Darius Blackwood. The apex of the city's food chain. He ignored the auctioneer. He ignored the men bowing their heads as he passed. He walked straight up to the edge of the stage. The handler holding my chain froze, his knuckles turning white. Darius didn't shout a bit. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a matte black card, and tossed it onto the wooden planks at the handler's feet. It made a sharp thwack. "Clear the debts of the beta who brought him in," Darius said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a low-frequency rumble that vibrated against my rib cage. "And give me the leash." The handler didn't hesitate. He dropped the chain like it was burning his skin, snatched the card, and practically tripped over himself, backing away. Darius looked up at me. He didn't smile. He didn't look at my body. He looked at my mouth, then up to my eyes. "Come down," he ordered quietly. I didn't move. My brain misfired. Authority usually came with spittle and raised fists. This quiet command felt like a trap. I gripped the fabric of my jeans, my toes curling against the wood. Darius sighed, a brief flare of irritation crossing his features. He stepped onto the stage, the wood groaning under his weight. He approached me slowly, hands visible, palms open. The scent of ozone intensified, making the hairs on my arms stand up. But underneath it, something else. Cedar. Rain on hot pavement. A deep grounding smell that made something primal in my chest tighten. He reached out and wrapped his fingers around the leather leash. He didn't yank. He just turned and walked. I had a choice. Stand still and let the collar choke me or follow. I followed. I walked off the stage, stepping into the absolute unknown, tethered to a thunderstorm. The back of the town car smelled like expensive leather polish and the lingering ghost of black coffee. It was a suffocating kind of luxury. I sat pressed against the furthest door, my knees drawn up tight to my chest, my bare feet tucked away from the pristine floor mats. I made myself as small as possible. A knot on a log. A piece of lint. Darius sat on the opposite side. He hadn't spoken since we left the warehouse. He had an iPad open on his lap, the blue light casting harsh geometric shadows across his jawline. He was typing, his fingers moving with rhythmic, aggressive precision against the glass screen. Tap, tap. Swipe, tap. The silence between us was profound. I was used to being ignored. My family specialized in treating me like a broken lamp. But this felt different. Marcus ignored me because he despised me. My father ignored me because I reminded him of my mother. Darius ignored me because I was a solved problem. He had bought me, acquired the asset, and now he was back to work. I watched the city blur past the tinted windows. Rain had started to fall, thick fat drops streaking the glass, distorting the neon signs of late-night diners and liquor stores. I shivered. The air conditioning in the car was brutal, seeping into the damp fabric of my cheap shirt. I rubbed my arms, the friction loud in the quiet cabin. Darius's typing stopped. I froze, squeezing my eyes shut. Stupid. You're making noise. I braced myself for the backhand. Marcus always swung backhanded when I distracted him from the television. Da you sight. That same tired exhalation from the auction floor. I heard the rustle of fabric. I flinched hard, pulling my arms over my head, burying my face in my knees. Something heavy and warm draped over me. I opened one eye, peering through the cage of my arms. A suit jacket, still radiating his body heat. It smelled overwhelmingly of him, that sharp pine and dangerous ozone. But underneath it, something grounded. Damp earth. Dark amber. The scent that made my omega hindbrain whisper safe before I could strangle the thought. I blinked, confused. I looked up. Darius was back to his iPad, wearing only his crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose thick forearms corded with veins. He didn't look at me. He didn't ask for a thank you. He just kept working. I slowly lowered my arms. I touched the wool of the jacket. It was softer than anything I had ever owned. Cautiously, feeling like a thief, I pulled it tighter around my shoulders. The shivering stopped. The scent enveloped me, tapping into some primal, deeply buried omega instinct. Safe. Sheltered. Claim. I hated that instinct. I crushed it down, replacing it with a cynical sneer. He's protecting his investment. You don't let a $50,000 asset catch a cold. The car turned onto a private road, tires crunching over meticulously raked gravel. High iron gates parted silently. We drove through a dense line of ancient oak trees before the estate came into view. It wasn't a Gothic mansion. It was a sprawling modern compound of glass, steel, and dark stone, integrated seamlessly into the side of a forested hill. The car stopped under a massive cantilevered awning. A driver in a dark suit opened Darius's door. Darius stepped out into the damp night air. He didn't wait for me, nor did he pull the leash, which he had unclipped from my collar and tossed onto the center console the moment we got in. I scrambled out of my side, the jacket slipping off my shoulders. I caught it, clutching it to my chest, my bare feet hitting the cold, wet pavement. Darius was already walking through the massive glass front doors. I jogged to keep up, terrified of being locked out in the dark. The interior was vast. Soaring ceilings, slate floors, minimalist furniture that looked terrifyingly expensive. It was cold. Sterile. There were no family photos, no clutter, just sweeping architectural lines and the distant hum of central heating. Mrs. Hartwell, Darius said. A woman materialized from a hallway. She was an older beta, gray hair pulled into a severe bun, wearing a tailored gray dress. She didn't look like a maid. She looked like an executive assistant. Yes, Mr. Blackwood, this is Caleb. Darius gestured vaguely in my direction while unbuttoning his collar. Put him in the East Guest Suite. Find him some clothes. Call Dr. Vance for a standard checkup tomorrow morning. He's malnourished. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes flicked to me. They were analytical, not unkind, but devoid of pity. Of course. And dinner. I ate on the plane. See if he wants anything. I'm going to my study. Do not disturb me unless the European markets collapse. Understood. Darius walked away. He didn't look back. He didn't tell me what the rules were. He didn't threaten me. He just vanished down a long hallway, leaving me standing in the foyer, dripping rainwater onto the pristine slate. Follow me, please, Mrs. Hartwell said. She led me up a floating glass staircase and down a corridor lined with abstract art. She opened a heavy oak door and stepped back. I walked in. The room was the size of my entire childhood home. A massive bed with crisp white linens dominated the center. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the dark forest. There was a sitting area, a massive television, and an en-suite bathroom clad in dark marble. The bathroom has towels. There is a robe in the closet, Mrs. Hartwell said smoothly. I will have a tray of food brought up shortly. Is there anything specific you require? I stared at her. I pointed to my throat, then shook my head. I am aware you are nonverbal, Caleb, she said patiently. You can nod or shake your head or write it down. There is a notepad on the nightstand. I shook my head. I didn't want anything. I just wanted her to leave so I could figure out where the trap was. Very well. Good night. She stepped out and closed the door. I waited for the heavy click of a deadbolt. Silence. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. I reached out my trembling hand and grasped the brushed steel handle. I pushed down. The door opened smoothly. It wasn't locked. I backed away, my breath coming slightly faster. A cage with an open door is far more terrifying than a locked one. It means the keeper is confident you have nowhere else to go, or they want you to run so they have an excuse to hunt. I retreated to the bathroom. I locked that door. It made me feel marginally better. I ignored the massive walk-in shower and the glowing vanity mirrors. Instead, I grabbed the thick plush bath mat, dragged it to the narrow space between the toilet and the cold marble wall, and curled up into a tight ball. I pulled Darius's jacket over my head, burying my nose in the scent of pine and ozone, and waited for the punishment that I was certain was coming. I woke up to the agonizing ache of my own ribs pressing into the marble floor. My neck was stiff, bent at an unnatural angle against the porcelain base of the toilet. Dust motes danced in a shaft of pale morning light, cutting through the frosted bathroom window. Panic flared instantly, a hot spike in my chest. Where was I? The smell hit me first. Not stale beer and mildew. Pine, ozone, expensive soap. The Blackwood estate. I had been bought. I untangled myself from Darius's suit jacket, folding it meticulously with shaking hands. My stomach let out a hollow, painful groan. I hadn't eaten the food Mrs. Hartwell left on the tray outside my door last night. I had been too terrified to open the bedroom door again, convinced it was a test. Now the hunger was a physical claw tearing at my insides. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped into the bedroom. The tray was gone. Mrs. Hartwell, or someone else, had removed it while I slept in the bathroom. The realization that someone had been in the room while I was utterly defenseless made my skin crawl. I needed food. I needed to figure out the layout of this gilded cage. I slipped out of the bedroom, my bare feet silent on the thick carpet of the hallway. The house was dead quiet. The morning sun illuminated the dustless surfaces, making the entire place look like a high-end furniture showroom before opening hours. I found the stairs and crept down. The kitchen was easy to find. I just followed the faint, lingering scent of roasted coffee. It was massive. White marble countertops, stainless steel appliances that looked like they belonged in a commercial restaurant, and an island the size of a small boat. I moved quickly, darting from the doorway to the pantry. I didn't dare open the massive double-door refrigerator. It might beep, or the light might alert someone. Instead, I found a loaf of artisanal bread on the counter in a wooden box. I tore a chunk off with my hands, shoving the dried bread into my mouth. It tasted like ash, but my stomach clamped around it gratefully. I grabbed a heavy ceramic plate from a drying rack, intending to take another slice back to my room. Footsteps. Heavy, rhythmic, approaching from the back hallway. My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned, dropping the bread. Darius walked into the kitchen. He was drenched in sweat, wearing dark athletic shorts and a compression shirt that clung to the brutal architecture of his chest and shoulders. A damp towel hung around his neck. The scent of ozone was suffocatingly intense now, spiked with the raw, aggressive musk of an alpha fresh from physical exertion. He stopped when he saw me. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. My fingers, slick with nervous sweat, slipped. The heavy ceramic plate slid from my grasp. Time seemed to slow down. I watched it fall, the white rim spinning, catching the sunlight. It hit the slate floor with a sound like a gunshot. Crash. Shards of white ceramic exploded outward, skittering across the floor. I didn't think. Instinct beaten into me over 2 decades took over completely. I dropped to my knees right there in the debris, curling into a tight fetal ball, my hands slapping over the back of my neck, tucking my chin to my chest. I made myself as small a target as possible. Waited for the roar. I waited for the heavy boot to connect with my ribs. I waited for the sharp, stinging slap across the side of my head that would leave my ear ringing for hours. Marcus hated broken dishes. Breaking a dish meant a week with a bruised jaw. I screwed my eyes shut, trembling so violently my teeth clattered together. My vocal cords strained, phantom screams trapped in a ruined throat. The silence stretched. 1 second. 5 seconds. 10. No yell. No blow. Caleb. His voice was a low, resonant rumble. It didn't sound angry. It sounded cautious. I didn't move. Moving was dangerous. Defiance brought worse pain. I heard the soft pad of his bare feet against the stone. He was moving slowly. The scent of ozone wrapped around me, heavy and damp with sweat. He stopped right in front of me. I could see the tips of his toes. Look at me. It wasn't a request. It was an alpha command, wrapped in velvet, slipping straight into my hindbrain. My body reacted before my conscious mind could stop it. I uncurled slightly, slowly lifting my head, keeping my hands over my neck. Darius was kneeling amidst the shattered ceramic. He wasn't glaring at me. His slate-gray eyes were scanning my posture, dissecting the tight, terrified knot of my body. His jaw was tight, a muscle ticking near his ear. But his hands were open, resting lightly on his thighs. He looked at the broken plate, then back at me. "It's a plate," he said softly. "It's baked mud." I stared at him, my chest heaving, air whistling through my nose. I didn't understand. Why wasn't he hitting me? Darius reached out slowly. I flinched, snapping my eyes shut again. He didn't touch me. I heard the grinding of ceramic against stone. I opened my eyes to see him using his bare hands to sweep the sharp shards into a pile. He wasn't being careful. A jagged edge caught the side of his palm, drawing a thin bead of dark blood. He ignored it. He pushed the broken pieces into a neat pile away from my bare knees. "You don't cower in this house," Darius said, his voice completely devoid of the violence I expected. "You don't beg. And you do not expect me to strike you. Do you understand?" I stared at the blood on his hand, then at his face. The cynical, defensive walls in my mind scrambled to find an angle. He's playing mind games. He wants you to trust him before he breaks you. It's a new kind of torture. But my omega instincts, the ones that read pheromones and micro-expressions, told a different story. His scent wasn't spiked with malice or the sour tang of anticipated cruelty. It was steady, annoyed maybe, but steady. He stood up, towering over me again. He wiped his bleeding hand carelessly on his towel. "Get up, Caleb. The floor is cold." He stepped over the pile of glass, walked to the massive refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and walked out of the kitchen without looking back. I stayed on my knees for a long time, staring at the little drops of red blood mixed with the white ceramic shards. My family sold me because I was broken. But as I touched the cold stone floor, a terrifying thought took root in my mind. What if the Alpha King is just as broken as I am? Rubbing alcohol burned the inside of my nose before the cotton swab even touched the split skin of my knuckles. I sat rigidly on the edge of the guest bed, my fingers digging into the plush white duvet. "Dear?" Vance, a thin bird-like beta with spectacles that constantly slipped down his narrow nose, smelled of peppermint and sterile latex. He moved with an irritating clinical detachment, pressing the icy bell of his stethoscope against my spine. I sucked in a sharp breath through my teeth. "Deep breath," Dr. Vance instructed, his voice a dry monotone. I obeyed. My ribs protested, a dull familiar ache stretching across my left side. I kept my eyes fixed on the floorboards, counting the subtle variations in the wood grain. Counting kept me tethered. It stopped me from bolting. Darius stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a heavy dark knit sweater that emphasized the brutal, unyielding architecture of his shoulders. His arms were crossed over his chest. He was silent, watching the examination with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. His scent, that volatile mix of crushed pine needles and electric ozone, filled the large room, pressing down on me. Severe malnutrition, Dr. Vance muttered, scribbling on a digital tablet. Chronic dehydration. Contusions in various stages of healing along the torso and upper thighs. There's an old fracture in the floating rib that wasn't set properly. It healed crooked. I shrank in on myself, curling my shoulders forward to hide the yellowing bruises painting my ribs. Humiliation tasted like bile in the back of my throat. I was an open ledger of abuse, a defective product laid out under harsh fluorescent lights. I waited for Darius to sigh in disgust. I waited for him to demand a refund from the auction house. Nobody pays $50,000 for a broken toy. In his throat, Darius asked. His voice was low, devoid of inflection. Dr. Vance stepped around to my front. He shined a blinding pinlight into my eyes, then gestured for me to open my mouth. I hesitated, my jaw clenching. Darius uncrossed his arms. The movement was slight, but the shift in the air was absolute. I opened my mouth, letting the doctor press a wooden tongue depressor flat against the back of my tongue. I gagged slightly. Congenital paralysis of the vocal folds, Dr. Vance concluded, tossing the wooden stick into a biohazard bin. The structures are there, but the neural pathways are dead. It's a permanent condition. Surgery won't fix it. Therapy won't fix it. He is, for all intents and purposes, entirely mute. I dropped my gaze back to the floor. Defective. The word echoed in my skull, carrying my father's drunken sneer. Darius didn't say anything for a long time. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I gripped the duvet tighter, my knuckles turning white. My heart hammered against my crooked rib. This was it. He was calculating the loss. He was going to drag me back to the warehouse. Then Darius's scent spiked. It wasn't directed at me. The ozone flared, sharp and dangerous, flooding the room with a sudden oppressive, heavy pressure that made Dr. Vance stumble back half a step, dropping his tablet to his side. Fix the malnutrition, Darius ordered. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it vibrated with a suppressed violence that made my stomach drop. Give Mrs. Hartwell a dietary regimen. Vitamins. Whatever he needs. If anything hurts him, prescribe something for the pain. Dr. Vance swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Yes, Mr. Blackwood. Darius turned on his heel and walked down the hall. He didn't look at me. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He just left, taking the storm with him. I let out a shaky exhale, my lungs burning. The cynical voice in my head scrambled for footing. He's protecting his investment. You don't put premium gas in a wrecked car unless you plan on fixing it up to sell. I clung to that thought. It made sense. It was transactional. Transactional, I could survive. Compassion would kill me. Cashmere feels wrong against skin that expects burlap. 14 days had passed since the auction. 14 days of an agonizing, quiet routine. I woke up. I ate the meticulously prepared meals Mrs. Hartwell left on a tray outside my unlocked door, and I stared out the massive windows at the rain-soaked forest. I was wearing a gray sweater Mrs. Hartwell had provided. It was so soft it felt like spun air, but it hung off my emaciated frame like a tent. I paced the length of the guest room, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. My fingers drifted to my throat, scratching at the stiff, unyielding leather. The auction collar. Darius had taken the leash, but he had never removed the collar. The thick leather chafed against my skin, the heavy metal buckle resting right over my Adam's apple. It smelled of old oil, sweat, and my own sour fear. It was a physical anchor to my reality. I was an own thing. The soft bed, the warm food, the quiet house, none of it changed the heavy leather biting into my neck. I couldn't take it anymore. The walls of the enormous bedroom felt like they were closing in. The silence was too loud. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The house was a tomb of glass and slate. I crept down the floating staircase, my bare feet making no sound. I didn't know what I was looking for. An exit. A clue. A reason to be terrified. I found the library. The heavy double doors of dark oak were cracked open. The scent of old paper, binding glue, and intense, concentrated pine wafted into the hallway. I peeked through the gap. Darius sat behind a massive desk carved from a single slab of dark wood. A single desk lamp illuminated scattered financial documents and half-empty tumblers of amber liquid. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his slate-gray eyes. He was staring blindly at a laptop screen, rubbing his temples with thick, calloused fingers. I should have walked away. The survival instinct that had kept me alive for 23 years screamed at me to retreat to my corner and stay invisible. But my throat itched. The collar pinched. I shifted my weight. The floorboard beneath my foot gave a microscopic, almost inaudible squeak. Darius's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto the gap in the doors. For a split second, a flash of pure predatory alpha instinct hardened his features, his pupils dilating. Then he recognized my scent. The tension bled out of his shoulders, replaced by a profound, weary sigh. "Come in, Caleb." I froze. Flight or fight? I had no fight, and fleeing would only initiate a chase. I pushed the heavy oak door open, slipping into the room. The library was cavernous, lined with thousands of books, but the air felt thin, dominated entirely by his presence. I stopped 10 feet from the desk, wrapping my arms around my waist in a defensive hug. I kept my chin tucked down, but my eyes darted up, watching his hands. Darius closed the laptop. The sudden snap made me flinch. He leaned back in his leather chair, studying me. He looked at the oversized gray sweater, the way I was folding into myself. Then his gaze drifted up and locked onto the thick black leather strapped around my neck. His jaw tightened. The muscle near his ear ticked rhythmically. "Come here," he commanded softly. My stomach plummeted. This was it. The honeymoon period was over. He wanted to use what he bought. I forced my legs to move, dragging my feet across the antique Persian rug. Every step felt like walking to a gallows. I stopped beside his chair, my breathing shallow, my heart trying to batter its way out of my crooked ribs. Darius turned his chair to face me. He didn't reach for my waist. He didn't pull me onto his lap. He reached up, his large hands hovering just inches from my throat. "Hold still," he murmured. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the snap of the neck, the tightening of the strap. I held my breath until my lungs screamed. His fingers brushed against my skin. They were rough, calloused, but incredibly warm. He didn't grab. He slid his thumbs under the heavy leather collar, keeping his touch feather light against my bruised flesh. I heard the faint clink of metal. The pressure vanished. A rush of cool, conditioned air hit the raw, sweaty skin of my neck. I snapped my eyes open, stumbling back a step. Darius held the ugly black auction collar in his hand. He looked at it like it was a rotting piece of meat. Disgust rolled off him in waves, thick and acrid in his scent. I stared at him, my chest heaving. I waited for him to open a drawer. I waited for him to pull out a new collar, something sleek, something with his name engraved on it. A tracker, a choke chain. Every Omega with a master had a collar. It was the law of their brutal biology. Darius stood up. He walked past me, carrying the leather strap. He approached the massive stone fireplace at the end of the room, where a low fire still crackled. Without a word, he tossed the collar into the flames. The leather hissed. Thick black smoke curled up the chimney. The smell of burning hair and old grease briefly overpowered the pine in the room. Darius turned around, leaning his shoulder against the stone mantel. He shoved his hands into his pockets. "I don't keep pets, Caleb," he said, his voice a low rumble over the crackling fire. "And I don't leash people." I stared at the melting buckle in the fire, then back at him. My hands flew to my bare throat. It felt empty, exposed, vulnerable. A terrifying, dizzying wave of vertigo washed over me. I wanted the collar back. The collar made sense. It defined the rules. It told me exactly who I was and what to expect. Without the leather, I was untethered, floating in a terrifying void where the Alpha King didn't beat me, didn't use me, and burn my chains. Tears, hot, shameful, and entirely unbidden, pricked the corners of my eyes. I hated them. I hated him for making me cry when my brother's fists couldn't. I backed away toward the door, my breathing coming in ragged, silent gasps. Darius didn't move to stop me. He just watched me unravel, his slate-gray eyes anchoring me to the floor even as my mind spun completely out of control. Phantom pressure squeezed my throat for days. I found myself reaching up to scratch at a leather collar that was currently nothing more than a stain of ash in Darius's fireplace. My fingers would brush bare skin, and a cold shock of panic would seize my chest. I was naked without it. I was a kite with a snapped string, waiting for the wind to slam me into the dirt. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest suite, blurring the pine trees into dark, jagged smears. It was a violent storm. The sky was bruised purple and black, and the thunder didn't just boom. It cracked, a sharp concussive sound that vibrated up through the soles of my feet. Crack. I flinched, my shoulders slamming into the wall. It sounded exactly like a wooden baseball bat hitting drywall. Marcus used to swing a bat at the walls when his favorite sports teams lost, missing my head by inches just to watch me cower. Boom. The lights in the bedroom flickered, buzzed an angry yellow, and died. Absolute darkness swallowed the room. The hum of the central heating ground to a halt. The silence of the house was suddenly deafening, amplified by the roar of the rain outside. My breathing shallow and erratic, I slid down the wall until my hips hit the floorboards. I scrambled backward, a panicked crab walk, until I wedged myself into the narrow corner between the heavy mahogany dresser and the wall. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms tightly around my legs. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the darkness behind my eyelids was exactly the same as the darkness in the room. I was back in the pen. The auction house power grid had failed once. The handlers had walked through the dark with heavy flashlights and stun batons, laughing as they jolted anyone who made a sound. I bit down on the meat of my forearm to keep my breath from wheezing outward. I tasted salt and copper. Footsteps. They weren't the hurried, light steps of Mrs. Hartwell. They were heavy, measured, and completely unbothered by the darkness. They paused outside my door. The handle turned. The door swung open, hinges entirely silent. A flashlight beam swept across the room. It cut through the dark, illuminating the unmade bed, the empty armchair, and finally the corner where I was trying to merge my molecular structure with the plaster wall. The beam hit my face. I squeezed my eyes tighter, burying my face into my wet forearm, waiting for the heavy hand to drag me out by my hair. The light clicked off. The room plunged back into pitch black. I held my breath, every muscle in my body strung tight enough to snap. I heard the soft rustle of fabric. Heavy sigh. Then a distinct thud and a rustle. Darius had sat down on the floor. He wasn't close. He was leaning against the door frame, a good 15 feet away in the absolute dark. His scent bloomed, unhindered by the sterile air conditioning. The sharp bite of ozone was still there, but muted, grounded by the deep, rich scent of damp earth and cedarwood. It was a heavy, anchoring smell. The generators will kick in on a delay. Darius's voice floated across the dark room. It was gravelly, quiet. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man who had worked a 14-hour day and just wanted a glass of scotch. Lightning hit the main substation down the mountain. I didn't move. I kept my teeth sunk into my arm. "You're bleeding," he stated flatly. The Alpha knew. He could smell the copper tang of my blood over the rain. "Stop biting yourself, Caleb. I'm too tired to clean the carpets, and Mrs. Hartwell is already asleep." It was such a bizarre, mundane complaint that my jaw went slack. The cynical mechanism in my brain stalled. He wasn't yelling at me for being pathetic. He wasn't dragging me out of the corner. He was complaining about the rugs. Slowly, agonizingly, I lowered my arm. My chest heaved silently in the dark. "Better," Darius murmured. We sat there in the pitch black. The thunder continued to rattle the glass, but the panic in my chest had hit a bizarre wall. Darius's presence was a massive, immovable object in the room. He wasn't trying to soothe me, which would have sent me into a spiral of suspicion. He was simply occupying space. He was acting as a physical barrier between me and the storm. 10 minutes passed. Just the sound of rain and the rhythmic, deep draw of Darius's breathing. Then a deep mechanical thrum echoed from beneath the floorboards. The generators. A second later, the soft amber glow of the bedside lamps flickered back to life. I blinked against the sudden light. Darius was sitting with his knees pulled up, resting his forearms on them. He looked entirely out of place, in his tailored charcoal trousers and crisp white shirt, sitting on the floor like a vagrant. He looked at me, his slate eyes scanning my posture, lingering on the crescent-shaped bite mark bleeding sluggishly on my forearm. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply stood up, brushing a piece of invisible lint from his slacks. "There's a first aid kit in your bathroom," he said, turning toward the hallway. "Use it. I expect you in the kitchen at 8 tomorrow morning." He walked out, leaving the door open. I stared at the empty space he had occupied, the lingering scent of cedar and ozone slowly dissipating, replaced by the sterile hum of the air conditioning. I touched the bleeding mark on my arm. It stung. But for the first time in my life, the pain wasn't a punishment. It was just a reminder that I was awake. Morning light bleached the slate floors, erasing the shadows of the storm. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the stone. The digital clock on the oven read 7:58 a.m. Darius was already there. He was dressed in a dark navy suit, his tie knotted perfectly, a silver watch gleaming on his wrist. He was leaning against the marble island, drinking black coffee from a plain white mug, reading an article on his tablet. I hovered in the doorway, my fingers twisting the hem of my oversized gray sweater. I had bandaged my arm. The white gauze felt like a neon sign flashing the word liability. Darius didn't look up from his screen. "Sit." I flinched at the command but obeyed, shuffling to one of the high metal stools at the island. I climbed up, feeling ridiculously small. Darius tapped the screen of his tablet, turning it off. He set it down, picked up a thick, heavy object from the counter, and slid it across the marble toward me. It was a notebook. Not a cheap spiral-bound thing. It was bound in thick, distressed brown leather. It smelled of tanning oil and fresh, heavy stock paper. Resting on top of it was a matte black mechanical pencil. I stared at it. My stomach performed a slow, nauseating roll. "Dr. Vance said you can't speak," Darius said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "He didn't say you couldn't, right?" I looked up at him. His face was an unreadable mask of weary indifference. He wasn't smiling encouragement. I looked back at the notebook. My hands were shaking. I hadn't written anything down in years. Marcus used to rip up my notes, claiming they were a waste of paper, that if I had nothing to say, I shouldn't bother leaving a paper trail. I reached out slowly, half expecting Darius to snatch it away. My fingers grazed the cool metal of the pencil. I picked it up. It was heavy, perfectly balanced. I opened the notebook. The pages were thick, a creamy off-white. I hovered the graphite tip over the first page. My mind was a chaotic static of questions, fears, and defensive sneers. Why am I here? Are you going to hurt me? When does the nightmare start? I swallowed hard, pressing the tip to the paper. My handwriting was jagged, rusty from disuse. I wrote one sentence, pressing so hard the graphite nearly snapped. I turned the notebook around and pushed it back across the marble. Darius looked down. What's the catch? He stared at the words for a long moment. He didn't look offended. He didn't laugh. He picked up his coffee mug, taking another sip before meeting my eyes. "The catch," Darius said, his voice flat, "is that you are collateral damage in a corporate proxy war." I blinked, completely thrown off balance. "The beta who put you on that stage, Marcus Hayes, he owed money to a loan shark who works for a shell company. That shell company is owned by a rival of mine. They use that underground auction ring to launder money." Darius set his mug down. He leaned over the island, bringing his face closer to mine. The scent of sharp pine hit me, crisp and absolute. I wanted to disrupt their cash flow. I wanted to insult them on their own floor. Walking in and buying their most problematic asset with a black card in front of their top buyers was a statement. He paused, his eyes flicking down to my throat, then back up. "I didn't buy you because I wanted a companion, Caleb. I bought you to piss off a man you've never met." I stared at him. The sheer, unadulterated cynicism of it washed over me like a bucket of ice water. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. There was no hidden affection. There was no twisted desire. There was no pity. I was a $50,000 middle finger to a rival CEO. It was a transaction. It was math. It was cold, hard, and entirely predictable. A strange, rusty sensation bubbled up in my chest. It took me a second to recognize it. My shoulders shook. I slapped a hand over my mouth, my eyes crinkling. I was laughing, or at least I was pantomiming laughter. No sound came out, just short, breathless exhales through my nose, my shoulders trembling with the force of it. The absurdity of my life, beaten for years, sold like cattle, only to become an accidental pawn in a billionaire's measuring contest, was hilarious. Darius frowned. The muscle in his jaw ticked. He looked genuinely unsettled by my silent, shaking laughter. "It's not a joke," he said, his voice dropping a register, a hint of alpha authority bleeding into the tone. I grabbed the pencil. I pulled the notebook back, furiously scribbling on the paper, my handwriting looping and frantic. I shoved it back to him. "It's perfect." Underneath, I added, "So I'm a lawn ornament." Darius read the note. The hard lines around his mouth softened marginally. He looked at me, a flicker of something like respect passing through his slate-gray eyes. "You're a guest," Darius corrected softly. "You eat my food. You sleep in my house. You do not break my plates. And in return, you get to exist without looking over your shoulder." He tapped the leather cover of the notebook. "Use this. If you need something, write it down. Mrs. Hartwell handles logistics." He checked his watch, the silver catching the morning light. "I have a board meeting. Vance will be back on Friday to check your ribs." He turned and walked away, the sharp click of his dress shoes fading down the hall. I sat at the massive marble island, staring at the notebook. The panic was gone. The suffocating dread was gone. I was a pawn. I was a prop. I picked up the heavy mechanical pencil and ran my thumb over the smooth metal. For the first time in 23 years, I didn't feel useless. I felt perfectly, wonderfully invisible. 28 days. That's how long I existed in Darius Blackwood's house without a single blow landing on my skin. My reflection in the master bathroom mirror was slowly becoming someone I didn't recognize. The hollow, bruised caverns under my eyes had faded to a dull, exhausted purple. The sharp, jutting angles of my collarbones were softening, padded by the heavy, rich meals Mrs. Hartwell produced 3 times a day. I was wearing a pair of soft, dark cotton sweatpants and an oversized black t-shirt I'd stolen from the laundry room. It smelled faintly of Darius's detergent, a sharp, clean scent of crushed juniper and cold water. But that wasn't the scent that haunted my dreams. His real scent, pine and ozone and that deep, grounding cedar, had started to feel like oxygen. I caught myself standing in doorways he had recently walked through, just breathing. I told myself it was a survival mechanism. Learning the predator's scent so I could track his moods, anticipate his violence. But there was no violence. And that was the problem. It happened on a Tuesday. I'd been writing in my notebook, doodling really mindless shapes and patterns when the first wave hit. Heat. Not the warmth of a room or the flush of embarrassment. This was a burning deep in my bones, starting at the base of my spine and radiating outward like someone had poured molten gold into my veins. I dropped the pencil. It clattered against the floor. My hands flew to my stomach. The muscles there were clenching, spasming, a deep ache that had nothing to do with hunger, everything to do with biology I had spent years trying to ignore. No, not now. Not here. I was an omega. I had presented at 14 in a house that treated my first heat like a nuisance rather than a milestone. My mother had thrown a box of suppressants at my head and told me to lock myself in the basement so I didn't stink up the house. I had spent 9 years suppressing my heats. 9 years of pills and patches and injections that left me hollow and numb. But I had been in Darius's house for nearly a month. No suppressants. No doctor's prescription. Just rich food, clean water, and the constant, overwhelming presence of an alpha whose scent made my hindbrain sing. My body had decided it was safe, and now it was demanding what it had been denied for nearly a decade. The second wave hit as I was scrambling off the bed. My knees buckled. I caught myself on the nightstand, knocking over the glass of water Mrs. Hartwell had left. It shattered on the floor, but I barely heard it. My skin was on fire. Every nerve ending was screaming. And underneath the fire, something worse. Slick. I pressed my thighs together, a strangled, silent gasp tearing through my chest. No. No. I couldn't. Not here, not in his house, not where he could smell. The door burst open. I didn't hear the handle turn. I didn't hear footsteps. I just looked up, and he was there. Darius. His suit jacket was gone. His tie was loose around his neck. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing those thick, corded forearms. But it wasn't his appearance that froze the blood in my veins. It was his eyes. The slate gray was gone, swallowed by black. His pupils had blown so wide there's almost no color left. His chest was heaving, his nostrils flared, and the scent. Oh God, the scent. Pine and ozone, yes, but amplified 100 times. It filled the room, filled my lungs, thick and heady and hungry. Underneath it, something darker. Smoke. Embers. The smell of a forest fire, of something wild and uncontrollable, barely leashed. Darius, I tried to say, but no sound came out. My throat was a broken drum, and even if it worked, I wouldn't have been able to form words. My brain was short-circuiting, drowning in him. He took a step into the room. I scrambled backward, my bare feet slipping in the broken glass. I didn't feel the shards cutting into my soles. All I could feel was the heat, the slick, the terrifying, compelling pull toward the alpha who was staring at me like I was the last source of oxygen in a burning world. "You're in heat," he said. His voice was wrecked, low, rough, vibrating with a frequency that made my bones hum. I nodded, frantic, my hands fluttering uselessly at my sides. "How long since your last one?" I held up 9 fingers. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them raised. 9 months. I shook my head. Tears were streaming down my face now, silent and hot. I pointed at myself, then held up the 9 fingers again. Then I pointed at the floor, at the room, at him. I didn't have the words. I didn't have the voice. But Darius understood. 9 years. His jaw tightened. The muscle ticked, once, twice, 3 times. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "You've been suppressing for 9 years?" I nodded. Something moved behind his eyes. Something dark and furious that wasn't directed at me. He took a slow, deliberate breath, visibly forcing his shoulders down, forcing the alpha rage back into its cage. "Okay," he said, his voice carefully, impossibly controlled. "Okay, Caleb. I need you to listen to me." I was trembling so hard I could barely stand. Another wave of heat rolled through me, and I doubled over, my arms wrapping around my stomach. A broken, silent sob racked my chest. Darius's scent flared, not with aggression, but with concern. It was the strangest thing I had ever smelled from an alpha in the presence of an omega in heat. No predatory satisfaction. No hungry anticipation. Just worry. "I want to call Dr. Vance," he said, reaching for his pocket. "He can prescribe emergency suppressants." I lunged. I don't know what came over me. 9 years of suppressed biology, 9 years of denial, 9 years of telling myself I didn't need this, didn't want this, all shattered in an instant. I grabbed his wrist. Darius went absolutely still. His skin was hot under my fingers. Hotter than it should have been. I could feel his pulse hammering against my palm, rabbit fast, and I realized with a jolt of primal satisfaction that he wasn't unaffected. The Alpha King, the man who had looked at me like I was a solved problem, was struggling. "Caleb," he said, and this time his voice cracked. The control was splintering. I could hear it in the ragged edge of his breath, see it in the way his pupils swallowed the gray. "Let go of my wrist." I shook my head. I pressed his hand against my chest, right over my heart. "Feel it." I wanted to scream. "Feel what you've done to me. Feel what 4 weeks of safety has undone." His fingers splayed against my sternum. His palm was so large it covered half my ribcage. He didn't pull away. God, he breathed. The word was barely audible, more exhale than sound. "You smell." He cut himself off, jaw snapping shut. I waited. My heart was a wild drum against his hand. "You smell like home," he finished. An admission seemed to cost him something vital. "Like rain on dry earth. Like the first breath after being underwater too long." Another wave of slick soaked through my sweatpants. The smell of it, honey and wildflowers and something uniquely me, mixed with his pine and ozone until I couldn't tell where I ended and he began. Darius made a sound low in his throat. A growl, but not a threatening one. It vibrated through his chest, through his hand, through me, and my knees finally gave out. He caught me. His arms wrapped around my waist, hauling me against his chest. I was burning, and he was cool, not cold, but cooler, like a river after a fever. I pressed my face into the crook of his neck and breathed. Pine, cedar, bosom, and underneath it all, something that was just him. Something that made my omega hindbrain curl up and purr. "Caleb," he said, and his voice was rough-pained. "I can't, if you keep doing that." I didn't know what that was. Breathing. Existing. Pressing my overheated body against the only source of relief in a world made of fire? I tilted my head back, looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. His face was a mask of agony. Not physical pain, though I imagine holding back an alpha's instincts during an omega's heat was its own special torture, but something deeper. Something that looked like fear. "I won't take advantage of you," he said, and the words were gritted out between clenched teeth. "Not like this. Not when you can't." I pressed 2 fingers against his lips. He fell silent. I pulled back just enough to reach for the notebook on the nightstand. My hands were shaking so badly the pencil slipped twice before I could grip it. I scrawled 3 words, the letters jagged and desperate. "I trust you." I turned the notebook around. Darius stared at the words. His throat worked. His arms tightened around me. He stopped. Swallowed. Started again. "That's the most terrifying thing anyone has ever said to me." I tilted my head, questioning. He pulled me closer until there was no space left between us. His nose brushed against my temple, then lower, tracing the line of my jaw. He wasn't kissing, not yet, just scenting, mapping the curve of my neck with shallow breaths. "Do you know what you're asking for?" he murmured against my skin. I shivered, nodded. "A claiming bite isn't just a mark, Caleb. It's permanent. It ties your heat to my rut. It ties your life to mine. If something happens to me..." I pressed the notebook against his chest. He looked down. "Nothing is going to happen to you." The sound escaped him, half laugh, half groan. "You don't know that." "I know." I underlined the words twice. "You're the Alpha King. And you didn't hit me when I broke your plate." He blinked. "What?" That's how I knew. I wrote faster, the words spilling out of me like water from a broken dam. My family hit me for everything. Breathing too loud. Looking the wrong way. Existing. You didn't hit me for breaking something valuable. You cleaned it up yourself. You bled on the floor and you didn't even get angry. I paused, then added, you put your jacket on me when I was cold. Darius was very still. You sat on the floor in the dark so I wouldn't be alone. You burned my collar. You gave me a notebook. I looked up at him, tears streaming down my face, and wrote the last words with a hand that had finally stopped shaking. You made me believe I'm not broken. So yes, I trust you. Bite me. The world stopped. Darius looked at the notebook. Then at me. Then at the notebook again. His scent shifted. The ozone didn't disappear, but it changed, sharpening into something electric, something alive. The pine deepened, darkened, until it smelled less like a forest and more like the heart of a storm. And underneath it all, the cedar. Steady. Grounding. Safe. I'm going to mark you, he said, and his voice was no longer rough with restraint. It was soft. Reverent. Not because you're in heat. Not because I bought you. Because you asked me to. Do you understand the difference? I nodded. You're not my property, Caleb. You're not my investment. You're not a lawn ornament or a corporate middle finger. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away my tears. You're mine, and I'm yours. That's what a claiming bite means. Equality. Partnership. A pack of two. I leaned into his touch. Let my eyes fall half closed. Do it, I wrote one last time, before I change my mind. He almost smiled. That's not how this works. You won't change your mind. How do you know? He pressed his forehead against mine. The answer was a whisper against my lips. Because I've been yours since the moment you walked off that stage. The claiming happened slowly. Not the bite itself. That was fast, a sharp press of teeth against the juncture of my neck and shoulder, a sudden burst of pain that dissolved almost instantly into something else. Something that felt like completion. But everything before that, the slow, deliberate undressing, the way he laid me on the bed like I was made of glass, the way he kissed every bruise that still lingered on my ribs, that took hours. He worshipped me. That was the only word for it. He worshipped my broken body with his hands and his mouth and his scent, and by the time he finally lowered himself over me, I was sobbing, not from pain, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, unbearable rightness of it. Ready? He asked, his forehead pressed against mine. I nodded. He bit down. The world exploded into light. I don't remember much of the next 3 days. Heat and rut intertwined like vines, wrapping around us until I couldn't tell where his skin ended and mine began. We slept and woke and kneaded and slept again. He fed me by hand when I couldn't hold a fork. He carried me to the bathroom when my legs wouldn't work. He held me through every wave, his scent a constant anchor, his voice a low murmur against my hair. You're doing so well, Omega. Breathe. Just breathe. I've got you. I'm not going anywhere. And when it was over, when the fever finally broke and my bones stopped burning, I woke up in a tangle of sheets and limbs, my head pillowed on his chest, his hand tangled in my hair. The bite mark on my neck was already healing. A scar that would never fade. A sign to the world that I belonged to someone. But the real claim wasn't the bite. It was the way he looked at me when he realized I was awake. Sleepy. Soft. Human. Hey, he said. I smiled. No sound. Just the curve of my lips, the crinkle of my eyes. He smiled back. Hey yourself. I reached for the notebook on the nightstand. My hand was steady now. The tremors were gone. I'm hungry. Darius laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, the first I'd ever heard from him. I'll make you breakfast. You can cook? Don't sound so surprised. I wrote, you're a billionaire. I assumed you had people for that. He read the note, still smiling, and kissed the top of my head. I have people for a lot of things. But making you breakfast. That's mine. He got up, completely unself-conscious in his nakedness, and walked toward the bathroom. I watched him go, tracing the lines of his back, the claiming mark I had left on his own neck, a mirror of his on me. He stopped at the doorway. Look back. One more thing, he said. I tilted my head. The man who sold you. Marcus. His voice flattened, the Alpha King bleeding through the softness. He won't bother you again. I made sure of it. I waited. I didn't hurt him, Darius said, reading the question in my eyes. I didn't need to. I just made it very, very clear that if he ever comes near you, he'll lose everything. His house, his job, his father's business. Every dollar he's ever touched. That's worse than hurting him. Good. He said it simply, without malice. He hurt you. He doesn't get to walk away unscathed. I stared at him for a long moment. Then I wrote, you're terrifying. Only to people who deserve it. And to me. He walked back across the room, knelt beside the bed, and pressed a kiss to my knuckles. To you, he said, I'm just Darius. 3 months later, I stood in the doorway of his library. Our library now, because he had added a desk for me in the corner, stocked with notebooks and pencils and a view of the forest, and watched him work. He looked up, smiled. Come here. I walked over, bare feet silent on the Persian rug, and let him pull me into his lap. He buried his face in my neck, inhaling deeply. You smell like honey today, he murmured. And rain. My favorite combination. I tapped his chest until he looked up, then pointed at myself, then at him, then made a writing motion. You want to tell me something? I nodded. Grabbed my notebook from his desk. I never thought I'd have this. He read the words. His arm tightened around my waist. Have what? Safety. Silence that isn't lonely. Someone who doesn't need me to speak. I paused, then added, someone who listens anyway. Darius was quiet for a long time. Then he turned my face toward his hand gentle on my jaw, and kissed me. Soft, slow, deep. When he pulled back, his slate gray eyes were bright. I spent my whole life thinking I didn't need anyone, he said. I was wrong. I needed you. I just didn't know it yet. I pressed my forehead against his. I know the feeling. He laughed, that warm, real laugh that was mine alone to hear, and pulled me closer. Outside, rain began to fall against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The forest beyond was dark and wild, but inside, there was light. There was warmth. There was the smell of pine and ozone and honey, tangled together until they were inseparable. I was mute. I would never speak a single word out loud. But for the first time in my life, I didn't need to. Because Darius Blackwood, the Alpha King, the storm in a charcoal suit, the man who bought me as a corporate middle finger and kept me as a home, listened to my silence. And in that silence, he heard everything.